Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to come to our presentation today. This is the result of our work on reducing precarity for female domestic migrant workers in the Kafala system, and we're really excited to jump into it today with you. Just a brief roadmap into our presentation. We'll start off with a bit of a background into the Kafala system, look at some of the current reforms done on the issues, evaluate some of the sending country policies, and then jump into some of the short-term and long-term reforms. So without further ado, I'll give it up to Carlos Montes to jump into a little bit of the background.
The concept of kafala has its roots in Islamic legal jurisprudence. It essentially means a type of obligation, suretyship, guarantee, and it has been used in anything from debt, delivery of goods, etc. But the modern kafala system has its roots in British colonial policy in the Gulf region, particularly Bahrain. The British had been using systems of surety in its colonies like India to regulate behavior of peoples, but the kafala system was the first time it used it to regulate migration. In the 30s, when pearls were discovered in the Gulf, there were a lot of migrants in the surrounding regions that were pouring into Bahrain in order to mine pearls. Because of their weak state capacity and inability to regulate migration, they created two systems. One was the Najefa system, and the other was the non-objection certificate system in order to regulate migrants. The Najefa system was a system of migration where the captain of the ship of pearl miners was responsible for the behavior and the documents for the rest of the ship. The non-objection certificates were used for uh, British bureaucrats who were coming from other parts of the empire to bring their families over. They had to attain a non-objection certificate. These two systems were merged in the 30s, and in the 30s, you also saw the first instances of non-objection certificates being required for domestic worker migration. After independence, this system would uh, spread to the rest of the Gulf countries, and it would come to be known as the Kafala system. And this is significant because the Arab states have a very large number of migrants, very large proportion of migrants to native population. And out of the 23 million international migrants in the Arab states, 43% are regulated by the kafala system, which comes up around 10 million migrants. And now I'm going to pass it on to Gloria, who's going to talk a little bit about the specific ways in which domestic migrant workers are facing precarious conditions in the Gulf.
The Kafala system creates conditions for abuse and exploitation, such as hyper-exploitation, wage appropriation, and human rights abuse. Women migrants, particularly, they make up the majority of domestic workers in the Gulf states. These workers earn less than the minimum wage and are forced to work long and unpredictable hours. Because domestic labor in the Gulf states has been gendered and racialized and therefore regarded as the dirty work or unskilled labor, domestic migrant workers remain one of the least protected groups of workers under national labor legislations. And so they're more likely to be hyper exploited or are paid lower wages than the minimum wage. And this is indicated by the statistics shown on the slides. Additionally, migrant workers are at risk of wage appropriation from recruitment agencies in their home countries. Since there aren't centralized laws governing these agencies, the majority of migrant workers aren't knowledgeable about recruitment service fees for travel, visas, and administrative costs, and so are vulnerable to being overcharged. Recruitment agencies are increasingly using the go now, pay later method, where migrant workers pay the recruitment fees from their monthly wages, essentially appropriating migrant workers' wages to cover those costs. These workers also have restricted mobility around Gulf countries and cannot change their employment status without their employer's permission. So their employers take advantage of this situation by not paying them their wages on time or not simply paying them at all. I'll now pass it on to Claire to talk more about human rights abuse.
Thanks, Gloria. So the Kafala system also creates conditions of human rights abuses against domestic migrant workers in the Kafala system. And firstly, these workers are often exposed to things like verbal and physical and sexual and psychological abuse without much recourse. And this is usually because they're often punished if they try to report abuse or even question the terms and conditions of their employment contracts. Female domestic migrant workers within the Kafala system face particularly precarious conditions because their labor is both gendered and racialized, and then often also de-skilled. Secondly, these workers also face risk of passport confiscation. They're technically prevented from escaping abusive employers because the kafil can restrict access to their passport or change their employment or transfer their sponsorship to another employer without their consent and essentially ban their reentry back into the country. For instance, in Qatar, they'd implemented a law that requires 72-hour notification to the employer, but that law fails to recognize that 72 hours would be likely ineffective for migrant workers who are trying to flee an abusive employer because passports could be confiscated, more abuse could happen in response to the attempt to flee, and then an employer could even physically prevent a worker from leaving. And then finally, the kafil have nearly complete discretion over the labor. So workers are unable to change their labor or employment without permission or prior approval from their kafil. So they're often punished if they report abuse or even question the terms and conditions of their employment contracts. So essentially, the kafala system has been compared to a form of modern day slavery due to all of these human rights abuses. And then in recent years, host countries have implemented a series of reforms, but as you can see in the chart, the reforms are relatively inconsistent across the board. In particular, some of the most high stakes, larger reforms, such as the implementation of a minimum wage or formal labor laws or standardized contracts, are largely ignored. And then from a comparative perspective, Qatar and Saudi Arabia both have implemented recent reforms, but the reforms in Qatar have largely been more successful than those in Saudi Arabia. In January 2020, Qatar implemented reforms that were hailed as this sort of end to the kafala system, given that it took away the requirements for migrants to obtain an exit permit to leave the country. And Qatar was under a lot of public pressure because of the use of migrant domestic workers to build stadiums for the World Cup. And Qatar now has an independent human rights commission, and instances like the World Cup situation forced reform in Qatar due to their hypervisibility. And I will say it's interesting to note that Saudi Arabia made it so that some workers can escape the kafala system, but it excluded domestic workers. So attempts at that reform largely failed. And Saudi Arabia lacks human rights oversight at sort of this national level, like the National Human Rights Commission. So perhaps that is why, reform is sort of more successful in Qatar than in Saudi Arabia. Now, regardless, most female to migrant domestic workers are still at extremely high risk. Now I'm going to pass it along to Abe.
Great. So to jump a little bit into some of the sending country policies, we find that there's a variety of socioeconomic forces that impact migrant worker outcomes. So to begin with, the first is economic development. The reality is that there's just a lack of economic opportunity and oftentimes high unemployment rates within the origin countries. And so that's why there's a lot of, there's a huge amount of promoting migration. Secondly, the recruitment agencies really lack accountability and transparency just because the system and the infrastructure for that isn't quite developed. And so oftentimes recruitment happens through private agencies, and it just opens the doors to exploitation and vulnerability of the migrant workers. Thirdly, the protectionist policies are actually very common. So social norms discourage migration, particularly for women. However, this protectionism leads to more informal migration, and oftentimes this also translates into higher transaction costs and increased vulnerability, as well as more just opportunity for exploitation of the migrant workers. And lastly, remittance. The economies of the origin countries oftentimes depend heavily on remittances. So while there are social norms that discourage migration, while people may not even want to migrate, it's just a fact of life that since there isn't much of an economic opportunity, the second best choice is for workers to migrate and send remittances back home to support their families. An important note here is that because of COVID-19, a lot of workers were sent back home, and many also had sort of their pay interrupted. And this has left many disillusioned with the idea of migrating to the Gulf for working opportunities. All of this to say, of course, that sending countries influence both the desire for migration as well as also sort of support the system in the countries. So moving on from here, we'll evaluate some of our the questions of how do we solve these issues. So looking at short-term policies from sending countries' perspective, first off, we recommend strict regulation of private recruitment agencies and implementing fees as well as mechanisms for transparency and accountability. Secondly, using increased demand from recovering economies as leverage for instituting new rights for the migrant workers. So essentially, as aforementioned, because of COVID-19, many workers have had to be sent back. And as economies reopen, there's a huge demand resurging for migrant workers. And so using this increased demand as negotiating leverage to sort of bring about standard employment contracts or insert migrant worker protection clauses can be really crucial in terms of helping sending countries empower their domestic migrants. All of this sort of flows into creating bilateral agreements. So essentially designing and implementing bilateral agreements from the sending countries with the host countries can be really crucial in regulating the migration process and ensuring fair conditions for the workers. So with that said, I'll pass it on to Natasha to talk a little bit about short-term policies from the host country's perspective.
Thanks, Abe. And so when we think about designing sustainable host country policies, we need to recognize that one of the fundamental issues faced by domestic migrant workers is a lack of collective bargaining power, in which there is no community and no ability for individuals to go ahead and come together and potentially petition local governments, their employers, or other organizations for better conditions. Thus, a lot of the creation of collective bargaining needs to be two-pronged. It has to be both grassroots led and also gets institutional support. We in particular recommend looking at providing union organization skills through the International Domestic Workers Foundation. And now the IDWF goes ahead and facilitates educating individuals about what a union is, how to go ahead and run meetings, how to set up plans, and how to create a hierarchy. This is really important because currently in host countries, unionization laws are very spotty, and the ones that currently do allow for domestic migrant workers to actually join are very inaccessible. Just the meeting times are during their working hours, but the fees are too high, or there's also genderized component in there as well. And so providing individuals with the skills to create their own union and understand how to make that kind of community is really important. The second part of this particular plan is to go ahead and go to the originating country and create open spaces for domestic workers to connect prior to migration. This ensures that individuals are not simply solo migrating to the Gulf and therefore are not as ripe for exploitation because they have some more support systems in place. This is also an opportunity to create educational materials about the dangers and the precarity of going into the Gulf. Our goal is not to restrict individuals' migration, but rather to create educational resources so they can decide if they would like to migrate and have more understanding and can make a free and informed choice. Finally, we want to use the IWWF back in the collective bargaining to go ahead and create connections between these open spaces in the originating countries and the originating country embassy so that when individuals migrate, they have institutional support. Essentially, this is important because some countries have very good programs with their embassies. The Philippines will support legal aid and go ahead and centralize claims about abuse to ensure that individuals have access to that. Overall, all these little building blocks create collective bargaining and empower communities to connect with the embassies, which lays the groundwork for both legitimizing domestic work as a skill and therefore eventually as the legal reforms occur in the Gulf, it can go ahead and serve as a route in order to create collective bargaining power. Now, there are a couple other more long-term policies over on the next slide that we did also think about when it comes to sustainably ensuring that in the future, a lot of the abuses are prevented. The very first of which is focusing on an ILO-based recruitment agency. Now, normally the ILO does not take an active role in actually reshuffling migrants and creating workflows. However, in the 1950s, this was a job of theirs. And by creating a third branch or a third-party branch of making an ILO-based recruitment agency, essentially it would allow for the ILO to take a much more active role in this. This is really important because it increases transparency and reliability in the recruitment process. And it also ensures that this particular recruitment agency has the ethos and credibility to get a lot of people to join. It will also minimize bribes and debts imposed by the kafil, therefore lowering the human rights abuses. It also offers a way to centralize data regarding migrant workers, ensuring that all the human rights commissions and all the international organizations have more access to understand what is actually going on, where the migrants are going, and how targeted policy interventions can best help. To understand some of the other more long term policy recommendations, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Carlos.
Thank you, Natasha. As Claire had mentioned, one of the differences between Qatar, who had successful reforms, versus Saudi Arabia, which had more limited reforms, is their larger human rights infrastructure within Qatar. One of this being national human rights commissions that existed in Qatar, whereas they did not in Saudi Arabia. So one of the our solutions would be to continue attempting to build this human rights infrastructure where it doesn't exist, and ensuring independence of these structures like national human rights commissions to make sure they remain independent from the state in places where they do exist. We also wanted to address wealth inequality because most domestic migrant workers live in middle high income and high income countries. Also, most migrants move from low income to high income countries, and clearly, this wealth inequality is a major uh, factor for migration. So, we thought that wealth inequality, global inequality, should be addressed. And one of the things that we came up with was there being a reparations regime for imperialism and colonialism. This is too large of a topic to be addressed in this specific policy brief, but it's something that we think that should be entered in the conversation. Already last year, the current UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called for reparations for the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas. We believe that this approach should be widened to include all types of imperialism and to recognize the ways in which, for example, a British system like that of the Kafala system has continued to harm migrants and peoples many decades later. And with this, we reached the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for watching.